The Nile, iaro, ancient Egyptian, Ḥ'pī and Iteru, biblical Hebrew, hiaro, is a major north-flowing river in northeastern Africa, generally regarded as the longest river in the world. It is 6,853 kilometers long. The Nile is an international river as its water resources are shared by 11 countries, namely, Tanzania, Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, Congo-Kinshasa, Kenya, Ethiopia, Eritrea, South Sudan, and Egypt. In particular, the Nile is the primary water source of Egypt and Sudan. The Nile has two major tributaries, the White Nile and Blue Nile. The White Nile is considered to be the headwaters and primary stream of the Nile itself. The Blue Nile, however, is the source of most of the water and silt. The White Nile is longer and rises in the Great Lakes region of Central Africa, with the most distant source still undetermined but located in either Rwanda or Burundi. It flows north through Tanzania, Lake Victoria, Uganda and South Sudan. The Blue Nile begins at Lake Tana in Ethiopia and flows into Sudan from the southeast. The two rivers meet near the Sudanese capital of Khartoum. The northern section of the river flows north almost entirely through the Sudanese desert to Egypt, then ends in a large delta and empties into the Mediterranean Sea. Egyptian civilization and Sudanese kingdoms have depended on the river since ancient times. Most of the population and cities of Egypt lie along those parts of the Nile Valley north of Aswan, and nearly all the cultural and historical sites of ancient Egypt are found along river banks. In the ancient Egyptian language, the Nile is called Ḥ'pī or Iteru, meaning river, represented by the hieroglyphs shown on the left. In Coptic, the words iaro or iaro meaning the river, iaro, the canal Greek come from the same ancient name. The English name Nile and the Arabic names Nil and Anil both derive from the Latin nilis and the ancient Greek nu epsilon lambda omicron sigma. Beyond that, however, the etymology is disputed. One possible etymology derives it from a Semitic Nahil, meaning river. The standard English names White Nile and Blue Nile to refer to the river's source, derive from Arabic names formerly applied only to the Sudanese stretches which meet at Khartoum. Course. Above Khartoum, the Nile is also known as the White Nile, a term also used in a limited sense to describe the section between Lake No and Khartoum. At Khartoum, the river is joined by the Blue Nile. The White Nile starts in equatorial East Africa, and the Blue Nile begins in Ethiopia. Both branches are on the western flanks of the East African Rift. The drainage basin of the Nile covers 3,254,555 square kilometers, about 10% of the area of Africa. The Nile basin is complex, and because of this, the discharge at any given point along the main stem depends on many factors including weather, diversions, evaporation and evapotranspiration, and groundwater flow. The source of the Nile is sometimes considered to be Lake Victoria, but the lake has feeder rivers of considerable size. The Kagera River, which flows into Lake Victoria near the Tanzanian town of Bukoba, is the longest feeder, although sources do not agree on which is the longest tributary of the Kagera and hence the most distant source of the Nile itself. It is either the Ruvyeronza, which emerges in Buri Province, Burundi, or the Nyabarongo, which flows from Nongwe Forest in Rwanda. The two feeder rivers meet near Rusumo Falls on the Rwanda-Tanzania border. In 2010, an exploration party went to a place described as the source of the Rukarara tributary, and by hacking a path up steep jungle-choked mountain slopes in the Nongwe Forest found an appreciable incoming surface flow for many kilometers. kilometers upstream, and found a new source, giving the Nile a length of 6,758 kilometers. Gishabe is reportedly the place where the holy water of the first drops of the Blue Nile developed. Lost headwaters, formerly Lake Tanganyika, drained northwards along the African Rift Valley into the White Nile, making the Nile about 1,400 kilometers longer, until it was blocked in Miocene times by the bulk of the Virunga volcanoes. In Uganda, the Nile leaves Lake Nyanza at Ripon Falls near Jinja, Uganda, as the Victoria Nile. It flows north for some 130 kilometers to Lake Kyoga. The last part of the approximately 200 kilometers river section starts from the western shores of the lake and flows at first to the west until just south of Masindi Port, where the river turns north, then makes a great half-circle to the east and north until Karama Falls. For the remaining part it flows merely westerly through the Murchison Falls until it reaches the very northern shores of Lake Albert, where it forms a significant river delta. The lake itself is on the border of Dr. Congo, but the Nile is not a border river at this point. After leaving Lake Albert, the river continues north through Uganda and is known as the Albert Nile. In South Sudan, the river flows into South Sudan just south of Nimule, where it is known as the Bahr al-Jabal. Just south of the town it has the confluence with the Achwa River. The Bahr al-Ghazal, itself 716 kilometers long, joins the Bahr al-Jabal at a small lagoon called Lake No, after which the Nile becomes known as the Bahr al-Abyad, or the White Nile, from the whitish clay suspended in its waters. When the Nile floods, it leaves a rich silty deposit which fertilizes the soil. The Nile no longer floods in Egypt since the completion of the Aswan Dam in 1970. An unbranch river, the Bahr el-Zara, flows out of the Nile's Bahr al-Jabal section and rejoins the White Nile. The flow rate of the Bahr al-Jabal at Mongala, South Sudan, is almost constant throughout the year and averages 1,048 cubic meters per second. After Mongala, the Bahr al-Jabal enters the enormous swamps of the sub-region of South Sudan. More than half of the Nile's water is lost in this swamp to evaporation and transpiration. The average flow rate of the White Nile at the tails of the swamps is about 510 cubic meters per second. From here it soon meets with the Sabat River at Malakal. On an annual basis, the White Nile upstream of Malakal contributes about 15% of the total outflow of the Nile River. The average flow of the White Nile at Malakal, just below the Sabat River, is 924 cubic meters per second. The peak flow is approximately 1,218 cubic meters per second in October, and minimum flow is about 609 cubic meters per second in April. This fluctuation is due to the substantial variation in the flow of the Sabat, which has a minimum flow of about 99 cubic meters per second in March and a peak flow of over 680 cubic meters per second in October. During the dry season, the White Nile contributes between 70% and 90% of the total discharge from the Nile. In Sudan, below Rent, the White Nile enters Sudan. It flows north to Khartoum and meets the Blue Nile. The course of the Nile in Sudan is distinctive. It flows over 6 groups of cataracts, for the first at Aswan to the 6th at Sabiloka, and then turns to flow southward before again returning to flow north. One name for this is the Great Bend. In the north of Sudan, the river enters Lake Nasser, the larger part of which is in Egypt. In Egypt, below the Aswan High Dam, at the northern limit of Lake Nasser, the Nile resumes its historic course. North of Cairo, the Nile splits into 2 branches that feed the Mediterranean: the Rosetta branch to the west and the Damietta to the east, forming the Nile Delta. Tributaries At Barra River, below the confluence with the Blue Nile, the only major tributary is the Barra River, roughly halfway to the sea, which originates in Ethiopia north of Lake Tana, and is around 800 kilometers long. The Barra flows only while there is rain in Ethiopia and dries very rapidly. During the dry period of January to June, it typically dries up. It joins the Nile approximately 300 kilometers north of Khartoum. Blue Nile. The Blue Nile to Ethiopians, Arabic transliterated, Nil al-Azraq, springs from Lake Tana in the Ethiopian highlands. The Blue Nile flows about 1,400 kilometers to Khartoum, where the Blue Nile and White Nile join to form the Nile. 90% of the water and 96% of the transported sediment carried by the Nile originates in Ethiopia, with 59% of the water from the Blue Nile. The erosion and transportation of silt only occurs during the Ethiopian rainy season in the summer. However, when rainfall is especially high on the Ethiopian plateau, the rest of the year, the great rivers draining Ethiopia into the Nile have the weaker flow. The flow of the Blue Nile varies considerably over its yearly cycle and is the main contribution to the large natural variation of the Nile flow. During the dry season, the natural discharge of the Blue Nile can be as low as 113 cubic meters per second, although upstream dams regulate the flow of the river. During the wet season, the peak flow of the Blue Nile often exceeds 5,663 cubic meters per second in late August. Before the placement of dams on the river, the yearly discharge varied by a factor of 15 at Aswan. Peak flows of over 8,212 cubic meters per second occurred during late August and early September, and minimum flows of about 552 cubic meters per second occurred during late April and early May. Bahr el-Ghazal and Sabat River. The Bahr el-Ghazal and the Sabat River are the two most important tributaries of the White Nile in terms of discharge. The Bahr el-Ghazal's drainage basin is the largest of any of the Nile sub-basins, measuring 520,000 square kilometers in size, but it contributes a relatively small amount of water, about 2 cubic meters per second annually, due to tremendous volumes of water being lost in the sub-wetlands. The Sabat River, which joins the Nile a short distance below Lake Nile, drains about half as much land, 225,000 square kilometers, but contributes 412 cubic meters per second annually to the Nile. When in flood, the Sabat carries a large amount of sediment, adding greatly to the White Nile's color. Yellow Nile. The Yellow Nile is a former tributary that connected the Wadi highlands of eastern Chad to the Nile River Valley c. 8000 to c. 1000 BC. Its remains are known as the Wadi Hawa. The wadi passes through Garb Darfur near the northern border with Chad and meets up with the Nile near the southern point of the Great Bend. History. The Nile has been the lifeline of civilization in Egypt since the Stone Age, with most of the population and all of the cities of Egypt resting along those parts of the Nile Valley lying north of Aswan. Climate change at the end of the most recent ice age led to the formation of the Sahara Desert, possibly as long ago as 3400 BC. Nile. The present Nile is at least the fifth river that has flowed north from the Ethiopian highlands. Satellite imagery was used to identify dry watercourses in the desert to the west of the Nile, and Nile Canyon, now filled by surface drift, represents an ancestral Nile called the Nile that flowed during the later Miocene. The Nile transported clastic sediments to the Mediterranean. Several several natural gas fields have been discovered within these sediments. During the late Miocene-Messinian salinity crisis, when the Mediterranean Sea was a closed basin and evaporated to the point of being empty and nearly so, the Nile cut its course down to the new base level until it was several hundred meters below world ocean level at Aswan and 2,400 meters below Cairo. This created a very long and deep canyon which was filled with sediment when the Mediterranean was recreated. At some point the sediments raised the riverbed sufficiently for the river to overflow westward into a depression to create Lake Moeris. Lake Tanganyika drained northwards into the Nile until the Virunga volcanoes blocked its course in Rwanda. The Nile was much longer at the time, with its furthest headwaters in northern Zambia. Integrated Nile. There are two theories about the age of the integrated Nile. One is that the integrated drainage of the Nile is of young age, and that the Nile basin was formerly broken into a series of separate basins, only the most northerly of which fed a river following the present course of the Nile in Egypt and Sudan. Said postulated that Egypt itself supplied most of the waters of the Nile during the early part of its history. The other theory is that the drainage from Ethiopia via rivers equivalent to the Blue Nile and the Atbara and Tak has flowed to the Mediterranean via the Egyptian Nile since well back into tertiary times. Hel-hama suggested that during the Paleogene and Neogene periods a series of separate closed continental basins each occupied one of the major parts of the Sudanese rift system: Melit Rift, White Nile Rift, Blue Nile Rift, Atbara Rift and Sahel-Nam Rift. The Melit Rift basin is nearly 12 kilometers deep at its central part. This rift is possibly still active, with reported tectonic activity in its northern and southern boundaries. The sud swamps which form the central part of the basin may still be subsiding. The White Nile Rift system, although shallower than the Bahr el-Arab Rift, is about 9 kilometers deep. Geophysical exploration of the Blue Nile Rift system estimated the depth of the sediments to be 5 to 9 kilometers. These basins were not interconnected until the subsidence ceased, and the rate of sediment deposition was enough to fill and connect them. The Egyptian Nile connected to the Sudanese Nile, which captures the Ethiopian and equatorial headwaters during the current stages of tectonic activity in the eastern, central and Sudanese rift systems. The connection of the different Niles occurred during cyclic wet periods. The river Atbara overflowed its closed basin during the wet periods that occurred about 100,000 to 120,000 years ago. The Blue Nile connected to the main Nile during the 70,000–80,000 years BP wet period. The White Nile system in Bahr el-Arab and White Nile rifts remained a closed lake until the connection of the Victoria Nile to the main system some 12,500 years ago. Role in the founding of Egyptian civilization. The Greek historian Herodotus wrote that Egypt was the gift of the Nile, an unending source of sustenance. It provided a crucial role in the development of Egyptian civilization. Silt deposits from the Nile made the surrounding land fertile because the river overflowed its banks annually. The ancient Egyptians cultivated and traded wheat, flax, papyrus and other crops around the Nile. Wheat was a crucial crop in the famine-plagued Middle East. This trading system secured Egypt's diplomatic relationships with other countries and contributed to economic stability. Far-reaching trade has been carried on along the Nile since ancient times. The Ishango bone is probably an early talus stick. It has been suggested that this shows prime numbers and multiplication, but this is disputed. In the book How Mathematics Happened, the First 50,000 Years, Peter Rodman argues that the development of the concept of prime numbers could only have come about after the concept of division, which he dates to after 10,000 BC, with prime numbers probably not being understood until about 500 BC. He also writes that no attempt has been made to explain why a tally of something should exhibit multiples of two prime numbers between 10 and 20, and some numbers that are almost multiples of 10. It was discovered along the headwaters of the Nile and was carbon dated to 20,000 BC. Water buffalo were introduced from Asia, and Assyrians introduced camels in the 7th century BC. These animals were killed for meat, and were domesticated and used for plowing, or in the camel's case, carriage. Water was vital to both people and livestock. The Nile was also a convenient and efficient means of transportation for people and goods. The Nile was an important part of ancient Egyptian spiritual life. Ḥ'pī was the god of the annual floods, and both he and the pharaoh were thought to control the flooding. The Nile was considered to be a causeway from life to death and the afterlife. The east was thought of as a place of birth and growth, and the west was considered the place of death, as the god Ra, the sun, underwent birth, death, and resurrection each day as he crossed the sky. Thus, all tombs were west of the Nile, because the Egyptians believed that in order to enter the afterlife, they had to be buried on the side that symbolized death. As the Nile was such an important factor in Egyptian life, the ancient calendar was even based on the 3 cycles of the Nile. These seasons, each consisting of 4 months of 30 days each, were called Ake, Peret, and Shemu. Ake, which means inundation, was the time of the year when the Nile flooded, leaving several layers of fertile soil behind, aiding in agricultural growth. Peret was the growing season, and Shemu, the last season, was the harvest season when there were no rains. Search from the source of the Nile owing to the failure to penetrate the sub-wetlands of South Sudan. The upper reaches of the Nile remained largely unknown to the ancient Greeks and Romans. Various expeditions failed to determine the river's source. Agatharcides records that in the time of Ptolemy II Philadelphus, a military expedition had penetrated far enough along the course of the Blue Nile to determine that the summer floods were caused by heavy seasonal rainstorms in the Ethiopian highlands, but no European of antiquity is known to have reached Lake Tana. The Tabula Rogeriana depicted the source as 3 lakes in 1154. Europeans began to learn about the origins of the Nile in the 15th and 16th centuries, when travelers to Ethiopia visited Lake Tana and the source of the Blue Nile in the mountains south of the lake. Although James Bruce claimed to be the first European to have visited the headwaters, modern writers give the credit to the Jesuit Pedro Paez. Paez's account of the source of the Nile is a long and vivid account of Ethiopia. It was published in full only in the early 20th century, although it was featured in works of Paez's contemporaries, including Balthazar Tales, Athanasius Kirger, and by Johann Michael van Slab. Europeans had been resident in Ethiopia since the late 15th century, and one of them may have visited the headwaters even earlier without leaving a written trace. The Portuguese João Bermudes published the first description of the Tizisat Falls in his 1565 memoirs, compared them to the Nile Falls alluded to in Cicero's De Republica. Geronimo Lobo describes the source of the Blue Nile, visiting shortly after Pedro Paez. Tales also used his account. The White Nile was even less understood. The ancients mistakenly believed that the Niger River represented the upper reaches of the White Nile. For example, Pliny the Elder wrote that the Nile had its origins in a mountain of Lower Mauritania, flowed above ground for many days' distance, then went underground, reappeared as a large lake in the territories of the Masai Zili, then sank again below the desert to flow underground for a distance of 20 days' journey till it reaches the nearest Ethiopians. A merchant named Diogenes reported that the Nile's water attracted game such as buffalo. Lake Victoria was first sighted by Europeans in 1858 when the British explorer John Hanning Speke reached its southern shore while traveling with Richard Francis Burton to explore Central Africa and locate the Great Lakes. Believing he had found the source of the Nile on seeing this vast expanse of open water for the first time, Speke named the lake after the then Queen of the United Kingdom. Burton, recovering from illness and resting further south on the shores of Lake Tanganyika, was outraged that Speke claimed to have proved his discovery to be the true source of the Nile when Burton regarded this as still unsettled. A very public quarrel ensued, which sparked a great deal of intense debate within the scientific community and interest by other explorers keen to either confirm or refute Speke's discovery. British explorer and missionary David Livingstone pushed too far west and entered the Congo River system instead. It was ultimately Welsh-American explorer Henry Morton Stanley who confirmed Speke's discovery, circumnavigating Lake Victoria and reporting the great outflow at Ripon Falls on the lake's northern shore. European involvement in Egypt goes back to the time of Napoleon. Laird Shipyard of Liverpool sent an iron steamer to the Nile in the 1830s. With the completion of the Suez Canal and the British takeover of Egypt in the 1870s, more British river steamers followed. The Nile is the area's natural navigation channel, giving access to Khartoum and Sudan by steamer. The siege of Khartoum was broken with purpose-built stern-wheelers shipped from England and steamed up the river to retake the city. After this came regular steam navigation of the river, with British forces in Egypt in the First World War and the interwar years. River steamers provided both security and sightseeing to the pyramids and Thebes. Steam navigation remained integral to the two countries as late as 1962. Sudan steamer traffic was a lifeline as few railways or roads were built in that country. Most paddle steamers have been retired to shorefront service, but modern diesel tourist boats remain on the river. Modern era the Nile has long been used to transport goods along its length. Winter winds blow south upriver, so ships could sail upriver and downriver using the flow of the river. While most Egyptians still live in the Nile Valley, the 1970 completion of the Aswan High Dam ended the summer floods and the renewal of the fertile soil, fundamentally changing farming practices. The Nile supports much of the population living along its banks, enabling Egyptians to live in otherwise inhospitable regions of the Sahara. The river's flow is disturbed at several points by the cataracts of the Nile, which are sections of faster-flowing water with many small islands, shallow water, and rocks, which form an obstacle to navigation by boats. The subwetlands in Sudan also forms a formidable navigation obstacle and impede water flow, to the extent that Sudan had once attempted to canalize to bypass the swamps. Nile cities include Khartoum, Aswan, Luxor, and the Giza-Cairo conurbation. The first cataract, the closest to the mouth of the river, is at Aswan, north of the Aswan Dam. This part of the river is a regular tourist route, with cruise ships and traditional wooden sailing boats known as feluccas. Many cruise ships ply the route between Luxor and Aswan, stopping at Edfu and Kiomombo along the way. Security concerns have limited crossing on the northernmost portion for many years. A computer simulation study to plan the economic development of the Nile was directed by H.A.W. Morris and W.N. Allen for the Ministry of Hydropower of the Republic of the Sudan. During 1955 to 1957, Morris was the hydrological advisor, and Allen, his predecessor. MP Barnett directed the software development and computer operations. The calculations were enabled by accurate monthly inflow data collected for 50 years. The underlying principle was the use of over-year storage to conserve water from rainy years for use in dry years. Irrigation, navigation and other needs were considered. Each computer run postulated a set of reservoirs and operating equations for the release of water as a function of the month and the levels upstream. The behavior that would have resulted given the inflow data was modeled. Over 600 models were run. Recommendations were made to the Sudanese authorities. The calculations were run on an IBM 650 computer. Simulation studies to design water resources are discussed further in the article on hydrology transport models that have been used since the 1980s to analyze water quality. Despite the development of many reservoirs, drought during the 1980s led to widespread starvation in Ethiopia and Sudan, but Egypt was nourished by water impounded in Lake Nasser. Drought has proven to be a major cause of fatality in the Nile River Basin. According to a report by the Strategic Foresight Group, around 170 million people have been affected by droughts in the last century, with 500,000 lives lost. For the 70 incidents of drought which took place between 1900 and 2012, 55 incidents took place in Ethiopia, Sudan, South Sudan, Kenya and Tanzania.